I feel like we've talked quite a lot on this podcast about diagnosis and identity and the way in which, giving a name to your suffering can be empowering, but also is problematic. So I don't want to be all like, I'm a TikTok teen diagnosing myself, but maybe I have the holiday syndrome. And I feel personally attacked that you sent me all of these articles.
I would never personally attack you, let alone for producing content purposes. I wouldn't do that.
So you're saying that your motives were largely unconscious?
Well, now that we've rendered them conscious, should I apologize? I don't even. I mean, look, one thing I think we'll learn about the holiday syndrome, right? And it's a tension that's present in talking about it and in all these articles about it, is that clearly it's not like a syndrome in the same way that, like, I don't know, serotonin syndrome or toxic shock syndrome is. And it's probably not even a syndrome in quite the same way as maybe imposter syndrome is, maybe. But it seems like and I think we'll struggle with this, but all these authors struggle with it too, where it's like, this is a cheeky thing. Like we're going to do like an all too Freudian, all too psychoanalytic understanding of this holiday, but also it's going to hit the real in some ways. And like, even when they're making these jokes about pumpkins, about getting stuffed or stuffing the turkey, like all this stuff, you're like, oh, they have to make these jokes because this is so fucking painful. Yeah. Like it's both serious and urgently depressing at the same time.
There's also, I feel like, a tendency so we reread a bunch of clinical literature, like including the first piece that names the holiday syndrome that everyone else subsequently refers to. And I think there's a sense of like distancing, in the sense that the cases are almost all like quite severe. And yet if you actually put a little pressure on the idea of the holiday syndrome, I think by the end of every article, you get to, one, the therapist or the analyst also has this holiday syndrome and better be aware of their own relation to it. And also everybody has holiday syndrome, which is incredibly comforting for anyone who's like, I have a vexed or fraught relation to the period between. I mean, I think the original holiday syndrome, it's an article, which we will get to in a little bit. It's like 2 weeks before Thanksgiving to like after New Year's, which is a non-trivial chunk of the calendar year.
Yeah.
What I keep trying to wash around in my head is holiday syndrome strictly locked to cooler weather, trees falling off of leaves, this kind of year for like this kind of trees falling off of leaves. Yeah. Leaves falling off of trees. The kind of stuff that we associate with the holidays. Like as it gets colder and a little bit more depressing, the days get shorter. We start experiencing the syndrome because we've attached like memories to that kind of a time and a space? Or is it really like, I keep thinking about the proliferation of marketing and that we're like bombarded with messages 24/7 now, everywhere you go. And now Thanksgiving starts the day at, before Halloween. So not only do we all have these complicated relationships to this word Thanksgiving or this word Christmas or whatever, but now we're also smashed over the head with like a certain tone and a certain like branding for this time of year that we can't help but like experience like these welling up emotions because like the word Thanksgiving is tied to complicated shit like in everybody's past. Is holiday syndrome a product of reading or recognizing a term, a word that's associated with this time of year? Or is it a biological clock thing where as the world gets a little bit more depressing, we also get depressed with it. And that's also tied in with families getting depressed together.
I wonder about that too. Cause like what we seem to be playing with, or fuck, these metaphors are going to keep happening, nibbling around the edges of
phrasing.
Applause.
It is like this.
We're not doing phrasing anymore.
It's like this question of like how much of the murky shit that happens in our unconscious and, the stuff that is more or less transparent in our conscious is about like biological facts,
like circadian rhythms.
Yeah.
And how much of it is about cultural constructions of meaning that give us a frame for interpreting certain biological facts, right? There's clearly a plasticity here, or at least we're vulnerable to kinds of traumas or experiences that cut across and reconfigure the biological and the sort of the social. And I guess when I find myself thinking of are two things here. Like one, I really want to hear from some people in the Southern Hemisphere about this, right? Because like I know they don't have like November Thanksgiving, though I'm sure they have their own ways of like commemorating settler bounty and abundance and stuff. But like my understanding from at least watching a bunch of Australian cooking shows is that it's traditional, at least, I mean, again, please correct me if I'm wrong, Aussie and Kiwi friends on this, but that like you eat a European style like goose or like a big thick meal full of puddings in the middle of what is your summer. And
I've never heard of grosser phrase than a big thick meal full of puddings, which is relevant to some of what we're going to talk about.
There's real body horror going on here, like gazing into the cavity of the turkey and then the abyss gazing back into you.
I know when Dan said the trees fall off the leaves, I was like, oh, you're just going back to Halloween. The one holiday that makes you feel good.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That's true.
The second thing I wanted to say was like one, well, it's actually a two-parter, I guess, of a second thing. Sorry, guys. Is like
it's okay. This is a 2-part episode,
it is.
So you get to have also 2-part contributions.
Is that half of these cheeky papers, right, are literally started out as addresses being delivered at holiday gatherings of psychoanalysts.
Of depressed psychoanalysts.
So you can see them all like kind of laughing at themselves and like as the dessert course is being served, someone's being like, isn't it funny how we all fantasize about magical feelings of togetherness and that we're actually families and we can fill the hole in our hearts through calories. And everyone's like, you can sort of see the analyst being like, oh yeah, this is not a defense mechanism. But the second thing I think about is that one paper we also read about, that sort of dated paper in many ways about managing the holiday syndrome in the kind of cloistered ward of a psychiatric institution, and specifically with
that was a really good piece.
Yeah, group therapy with schizophrenics. And, ostensibly these are people whose experiences of the world is diverges from the what we might call like the consensus reality or what passes for consensus reality in all its pathological forms. It's also constrained by the fact that many of them don't have day passes and stuff.
Yeah.
So they're all talking about how it's Thanksgiving seems to be coming earlier and earlier. And yeah, like it's how can they already be putting up these Christmas decorations and all this schizophrenics? Like, well, absolutely, there should be a rule. There should be a law about how it could only go up 2 weeks beforehand. And the analyst is like, yeah, that's really interesting. Let's talk about the significance of dates and, how we all have our own personal calendars and the weirdness of this. Let's keep on talking about, how we all think it's coming too early. And he keeps leaning into this as though it's schizophrenic ideation. And then he gets out of the session, looks at his day book and realizes
it's 2 weeks before and none of them have actually realized it. They've all collectively repressed the approach of the holiday.
It actually is, right? He's caught in it too. He was also, he was thinking this was a matter of like just looking at them and their pathological misunderstanding of time, but actually he himself was either dreading or in any event repressing the movement of time towards the holidays.
This actually happened in my life yesterday. I just
Really?
want to say I was one of my colleagues that I co-teach with. I've been, bombarding who's actually going to come on and talk about Christmas with us next and Freud on obsessive action and religious practice next month. And I've been just chattering nonstop about holiday syndrome for the last week. And in class, this class that we co-teach, we're like, okay, so next week and the whole class went, next week is Thanksgiving. And he was like, no, it isn't. That's not true. And I was like, no, it is. It's next week. I have it on my calendar. And then a few hours later, he texted me and he was like, Thanksgiving is next week. You were right. And I was like, I know I'm right. It was on the calendar. It was this like moment of reduplication of like, none of us can actually stand that Thanksgiving is coming.
No, it's like holiday syndrome. Like we're all down with the sickness one way or another.
I guess what I want to say is that as a person for whom Thanksgiving has always been very fraught, okay, like in my perfect like idioverse, I would cancel Thanksgiving and never have to attend one ever again. And reading all of these has actually made me feel a lot better.
You feel seen?
I just feel less alone. It was a sort of consciousness raising exercise about one of the things that distinguishes or that most people feel is they feel alone. And that they feel that other people are in a functional family and that the other people are having the warm feelings and other people are having this sense of like plenitude and abundance and rightness. And it turns out nobody is. Nobody is. listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Whitefield.
I'm Danielle.
And today we are getting into the first part of our two-part episode on Thanksgiving.
Let's carve this turkey.
All right, let's do it.
What's all the commotion? We've got another holiday to worry about. It seems Thanksgiving Day is upon us. I haven't even finished eating all my Halloween candy.
Here's my question. Do either of you have warm childhood feelings about Thanksgiving? I mean, or adult feelings, but I think for our purposes, since we are talking a lot about memories of infantile feelings and impressions.
I think for me, I came from a pretty cloistered upbringing. So I have like a weird love and hate relationship with holidays, all the major holidays, where on one hand, a lot of the associations now in adulthood have kind of, I don't know, bronzed, tarnished something with age. Like everything's a little bittersweet to look back on.
Yeah.
But at the time, I remember consciously thinking about how, especially in tight-knit communities, the holidays were a chance for everybody to go off script for like a month or two out of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And it always felt in my head like a kind of dance that everybody plays together, where everybody takes a step to the right and is a little jolly, and everybody takes a step to the left and gets a little silly. And like your relationship to jolliness or silliness kind of dictated whether or not you're going to have a good Thanksgiving or a good Christmas that year. Like if it was within you to be able to play along in the like line dance with everybody else,
Yeah.
then it was going to be a good year. But if you were like down in the dumps, if it was a hard year, if the idea of being jolly was like alien to you for whatever moment, then it was going to be a bad year and you're going to have a bad time. That was like kind of my experience with it. I always enjoyed the kind of like script shift that everybody stepped through, but also I had to take like an active participation in the step. And if I wasn't in the mood, if it wasn't vibing with me, then you're gonna have a bad time, bro. That was my experience.
I think we're behind the play wall, right?
Oh yeah.
We're not calling it that anymore. That was just the Barbie episode.
We're in the holding space of the transitional, playful creation space of Patreon gatekeeping. And
Sure.
I mean, I think for me, a lot of my memories about Thanksgiving as a child being good were vicarious. Right.
Interesting.
I remember like my dad, who was the eldest of 8, talking about Thanksgivings in his household growing up in the 50s, right, in Detroit. And he would have these stories about how they'd have a turkey for breakfast too, because basically he and all his brothers would be very, I mean, the lower middle class, right? They were all worked for Ford or various auto, like in the auto industry in various ways, but like they were, abundance was not a typical situation in that household.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
And so they would wake up to there being a small turkey in the oven. And like, because like they literally couldn't stand the smell of the turkey wafting through the house for the rest of the day. So at least they'd get the morning turkey before they had the bigger turkey later. And I always thought that was a delightful story.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
That sounds great.
By the same token, though, my personal memories, direct memories of Thanksgiving that are the ones that actually stick with me are of like Thanksgiving fails that are funny, or at least were a little bit dark. Like I have the other half of my family Polish, and I remember my uncle who had just immigrated from Poland that year, his first Thanksgiving, which is, is a big deal, and we'll talk about this in the literature, but like Thanksgiving experience is a big thing for immigrants, or at least a lot of them. And he had us over at the place where he was living, and it's like the morning of, and he's like, I can't wait to start cooking here. And then he takes out from the freezer a totally frozen turkey.
Oh no.
And I remember my dad my parents and him like trying to defrost the turkey like by holding it under the shower and stuff, and just like obviously you can't.
It's like straight out of Bob's Burgers.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it was. The Bob would never do that, right? Bob would be mortified.
No, but the episode where somebody keeps putting the turkey in the toilet and he keeps having to get a new turkey.
Oh yeah, that's a great one. That's one of the ones I watched one of the. Yeah, we have some clips. Yeah.
Lynn!
What happened?
The turkey! It's in the toilet!
What are you talking about? You had a bad dream. Go back to sleep.
This is not a dream. This is happening.
But then we went out. Ultimately, the conclusion was we went to like I think it was like Ming Garden or something, like some strip. The only place that was open was a strip mall Chinese restaurant. I remember being like, oh, this is an awesome aquarium. And just like watching these shrimp move around on Thanksgiving and just think this was really cool because no one else was there. The other thing I remember was going to see the parade.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as a New York kid. You must have.
Yeah, I had a lot of memories of that. And I remember a couple of the years where some of the, at those cross streets on Central Park West, where there's a east-west, like to the river, like wind tunnel, the balloons getting caught by gusts. And suddenly you realize like these things are actually fucking dangerous.
Yeah.
So I remember like a couple, I think it was Kermit one year, like people were like literally like, some of the people were like tethered to it, like their feet were off the ground, but also you would see up on the overlooking Central Park these amazing apartments where there'll be all these people like wearing various shades of salmon or Burberry or whatever, would be eating their canapes and drinking highballs or whatever the fuck it was. And suddenly like Kermit.
I love that this is your childhood understanding of wealth.
It's a story of class
canapes,
resentment.
salmon, and Burberry.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Kermit the
look,
Frog.
this was the early 90s.
No, I get it.
Suddenly this Kermit like veers and it's like it's about to crash into their window. And I saw these people leap back. And anyways, there's a tragedy here too, because at one point I think it knocked over a light pole and someone was seriously injured. But like that moment where, oh my God, we could all be killed by like SpongeBob or something. That was a real, I was like, yes, more of this, please.
So this is taking us into like the totem meal and like the fact that this is a symbolic patricide.
Small patricide, yeah.
Yeah. Can we? Okay, let me do a little bit of just outlining here. I pitched for this extremely busy time of year a very simple Patreon episode where we all go see a film and we talk about it, but in full Patrick Blanchfield style. He was like, "But what if instead we took an incredibly difficult topic and had 25 to 30 sources?" And so we have all spent the last week getting really, really, I don't want to say into Thanksgiving. I have this like horrible image of it, like the cavity of the Thanksgiving turkey. We have been reading everything from clinical literature on this thing that I promise we're going to tell you about called the holiday syndrome, to revisiting Freud's totem and taboo, to thinking in a variety of contexts about subtler colonialism. And we have realized this is 2 episodes. So the one that you're hearing today is largely going to be about the holiday syndrome. And the one that is going to drop actually early, the day before Thanksgiving, just as a little bonus, happy holidays from us here at Ordinary Unhappiness, is going to be about totem and taboo and about the subtler colonial dynamics of this holiday. So we are getting into familial and national traumas and memory and commemoration, but we're breaking it up into 2 parts.
We overstuffed with sources, and I went even further. Like I literally went into PepWeb and I searched for Thanksgiving, and I
tell everybody what PepWeb is.
And by the way, if you have an institutional login for university that's enables you to access it, it's the Psychoanalytic Electronic Publishing Archive.
Yeah,
it's amazing. It's basically nearly 150 years of psychoanalytic material.
Yeah, it's incredible.
It's an incredible searchable archive. But you can search for strings, articles.
It's the only thing I miss about being at Columbia University is access to PepWeb.
Yeah, I wish we could afford it. It's an amazing thing. But I searched for Thanksgiving, and I literally read the abstract of about 100 different articles and read a couple dozen looking for any occurrence of this in case literature. And there's only 1 or 2 like articles that really treat this specific holiday in a kind of granular way.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what we're going to do today we'll talk about this thing called the holiday syndrome more broadly. Then we'll talk about Thanksgiving as a specific instance of it.
Yeah.
And then next week we'll talk about it in terms of like it's the broader cultural work. So we're going to be considering like the family and our individual experiences of family as they're kind of put into the pressure cooker of this season. And then, Fanon will make this claim that like the nation state is the sum of its families, or like that family relations are kind of recodified continually in dominant state ideology. We're going to do some thinking about like what's the cultural work of bringing the families together in this. And I just also wanted to say that this is probably a defense on my part, at least working through my own anxieties about this holiday.
Mm-hmm.
But I did want us to offer this to our listeners because I think it's a really cool putting into play of like what can seem like goofy, vulgar psychoanalytic concepts, right?
Sure.
But that frankly are probably warranted when it comes to a holiday that when you look at it is both very natural, it's seemingly natural. It's like what we do
A
every year.
harvest festival.
Yeah, like we're an entire like I remember like talk about holidays being determinative, a whole like way of being. How much of our like educations in school were like now we're in Thanksgiving season and now we're in right.
Yep.
It was like
you never get anything done in the academic calendar after Thanksgiving.
exactly
It's the worst. And now I realize it's because everybody is actually reenacting their family traumas when they come back, and it's not just that they're tired at the end of the semester.
Yeah, and I think at that point, like it like on the meta level, it's going to give us a real interesting way for thinking about the way in which like libidinal economy and individuals and families relates dynamically to the vagaries of history, right, or even biology, Dan, right, but also to like political economy and the way history and stuff is remembered. But and more practically, we wanted to give you all something that you could listen to before the holiday.
Yeah.
To make the holiday, well, if you're dreading it, if you love it, whatever, at least now you may be able to think about it differently, or at least you'll have something that perhaps could make it more interesting when it happens. And it could kind of estrange or render uncanny stuff that you might otherwise feel either heimlich or bad about not feeling at home and heimlich in. So that's like our endeavor today. And we'll see how it works, but I think it's going to be pretty cool.
And if someone is an asshole to you at Thanksgiving dinner, you can just accuse them of having holiday syndrome. I mean, not that we actually really suggest that you weaponize psychoanalysis. That's not our ministry here. Yeah. But I'm going to suggest that we get into this first paper, and then we talk a little bit about its relation to something that Sandor Ferenczi called the Sunday neuroses, which we kind of now refer to as the Sunday scaries.
Sunday scaries.
The Sunday scaries.
Yeah.
But let's get first into this paper. So I want to read to you a quotation. This is the very beginning of James Cattell's piece from 1955, The Holiday Syndrome. And I'm reading it to you not just because it is the beginning of the piece, but also because it is the part that gets excerpted in basically everything else that we read. So it's fairly long, but here we go. The holiday syndrome is a convenient term to describe a fairly specific reaction in a certain group of psychoanalytic patients during the period beginning a few days before Thanksgiving, continuing through Christmas and until a few days after January 1st of each year. It is characterized by the presence of diffuse anxiety, numerous regressive phenomena, including marked feelings of helplessness, possessiveness, and increasing irritability, nostalgic or bitter rumination about holiday experiences of youth, depressive affect, and a wish for magical resolution of problems. This reaction frequently dominates the patient and his associations in analysis throughout the 5 to 6 week period involved. The patient may act out some of the regressive phenomena with family substitutes, or contemporary love object. He may deny the meaningfulness of the holiday season to him, though the emotional components and unconsciously motivated behavior remain. So I want to say one or two things here. First of all, and this definitely like hit for me, Thanksgiving is mostly about Christmas in a lot of ways. Thanksgiving is mostly about Christmas. And I think you see this in some of the clinical literature being like, oh, well, like we're going to have to talk. There's tons and tons of literature on Easter and on Christmas, but nobody's written about Thanksgiving because it's just so obvious. And there is this way in which the claim from this original piece is that there's something distinctively American about the version of holiday syndrome that the author Cattell is talking about because of the timing of American Thanksgiving and how it relates to the Christian holidays and then the New Year. And I want to just kind of note also that if you think about Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's. And let me also say, like, I'm Jewish, okay? Like I don't celebrate some of these holidays. In some ways it doesn't matter. Thinking about this in the American context, it is less about one's own personal celebration and more about the milieu in which you find yourself. So, Thanksgiving, family. Christmas, family. New Year's, you don't celebrate that shit with your family. So it's like home, out. And I think that's very interesting is like the year ends with these ritual gatherings of, like, to use Freud's language from Tudman, to it, like the clan gathers, right? For what, as we learned from the Buffy the Vampire Slayer episode, Thanksgiving episode, is a ritual sacrifice with pie. And then Christmas, again, in the domestic space, and very much about gathering. And if there is no gathering, there's a sense of loss. And this is, again, it's something that is demanded of people regardless of whether or not they're Christian. And then the new year flips around and there is a major expectation that you do not spend this with your natal family or with your extended family, unless those people happen to be also chosen family. So it is really like the end of the year reconsolidates. And it's like, well, how do we want to begin the new year? Let's get the fuck away from these people.
We can thematize what Abby's sort of talking about and connect it to a lot of other things we've been talking about on the podcast as like raising the question of like subject formation or like the normalization of certain social things or social experiences as a process of like making you into a subject, right? We call it subjectivization, right? And there is this way in which this last month stretch, right? This last 30-odd day stretch of the calendar year in the US in particular, it represents like this kind of pressure cooker for a lot of the things that make us, or that we are taught to understand as being fundamental to our identity, whether it be that we're believing Christians, or we see ourselves as rejecting that tradition, or we're Jewish, etc. Like one way or another, regardless of what we may volitionally want or prefer, this shit's happening regardless.
Yeah.
And you have to...
It's out of your hands mostly.
You're interpolated into it,
yes.
right? And I mean, I want to just recognize the... with real affection and sympathy, all like the retail workers out there listening to this, right? Because like I've only like worked in service positions. I've never like worked in a storefront, right? But like I know, and I have a lot of dear friends who have, and that bit where suddenly the Christmas music starts playing and people bring that anxiety, and specifically like that like Black Friday thing too, like that pressure cooker of like, oh shit, this is happening. And my own dim memory of this just peripherally is like traveling to a state where there was like a state-run liquor store thing, right? And this is they don't have Black Friday sales in the state-run liquor store, right? But for whatever reason, there was like a breakfast post-Thanksgiving thing, and I had to go out to get champagne for people, right? Because there wasn't any in the house. And so I'm in this strip mall liquor store at 9 a.m. when it opens, God bless state businesses. And I'm feeling, I walk in to start putting a couple bottles of like Krug or something in this cart. And there's like a moment where the music for the day starts, like they're piping it in through the speakers, and it goes from like, I think it was like Kenny Loggins or something, suddenly to a chorus singing Silent Night. And it is Friday morning at 9 a.m. and I'm in the liquor store, along with also the people who are there because, they need alcohol to
at
maintain.
9 a.m.
Yeah, the people who are there as a matter of course, and not just as a question of holiday exception. And the look on their faces as they trudged in, and the meeting the gaze, but then averting the gaze, and the look on the faces of the people who work there, I was like, oh, fuck, it's happening again. And he was like, yeah, you're there. Whether you just work here or live here, you're going to have to deal with it.
Yeah.
So this paper is from 1955. Even the subsequent papers we were reading, the one Patrick was talking about, where there is a group of schizophrenic patients in group therapy, is from 75, and they're like 2 weeks. So we are now looking at like something that is quite different, but is in some ways like the logical outgrowth of the the structure that's being described here. So I want to get into beyond what is holiday syndrome, who has holiday syndrome.
Yeah.
And there's a passage that I want to read you. And the short version is a very specific group of people. And the long version is maybe everybody that has a family. So neither of those things is exactly true. Okay, so quote, and again, this is from the Cattell piece. The holiday season has a sensitizing effect on those individuals who receive little or no affection or who cannot accept that which is offered. This type of patient usually has difficulty in establishing close emotional ties and has feelings of isolation, loneliness, and boredom, as well as an inclination to frequent self-evaluation in a derogatory sense. The holiday syndrome is an exaggeration of this underlying pattern, especially in view of the cultural emphasis on emotional closeness and evaluation of self. The syndrome usually occurs in those who have few or no well-established emotional relationships outside the family and a very ambivalent relationship with present family. There is, in most instances, a history of disruption of the family constellation, with separation or divorce of parents or death of one or both parents. Especially among patients in late adolescence and young adulthood with such a history, there are poorly crystallized concepts of self, of social role, of relationship of man to woman and child to parent. There's a feeling of being unloved, unwanted, and not belonging to any family group. So what I want to point out to you is that certainly there are specific elements in this description that are not universal. Okay. There's particular features in the family of origin that can be predictive, right? Not necessarily determinative, but predictive. But think about the idea of like holiday syndrome is something that occurs in people who have an ambivalent relationship with present family. Okay, so that is anybody who has a family, right? That anybody that belongs to a family system and also anybody that doesn't really belong to a family system. Like who doesn't have ambivalent relations to family? And I'm reading this as somebody who I'm reading this from an academic perspective, but I'm also reading this as a person in the world who has to endure this holiday season. So I read this as being a spectrum more than a diagnosis in the sense that, I mean, it's a helpful diagnostic, and it's also helpful, and this comes out in a bunch of the papers that we read, in the sense that like this is a time of heightened suffering from existing family dynamics. And thus, in some ways, it can be deeply generative for like those 5 to 6 weeks in analysis or in whatever kind of therapy, because certain defenses might be more visible. And I guess I wanted to say also that I recognize this, just to get back into thinking about the experience of Thanksgiving and also of Christmas from a position of non-identification. I recognized this in myself as like a helpful way of thinking as a person who hates Thanksgiving. And I'm now realizing that it's because of like, I come from a household with multiple religions, and there's a sort of push-pull that happens in December when you belong to a family that has multiple and possibly incompatible religious backgrounds, is like, oh, Thanksgiving is about Christmas. Thanksgiving is about Christmas. But also that this is very much, it's a spectrum. And I notice the way that the authors, even though we get these moments like the one that Patrick was describing, where it's like, oh, the therapist is like so thoroughly inhabiting his subject supposed to know role that he misses, that he also is dreading Thanksgiving to the point that he's repressed that it's now here. But I do think there's something happening with the case literature being at pains to sort of distance the authors from this, even as the descriptions themselves have a sense of like, you're going to be subject to this to one degree or another. The other thing that it made me think of is a piece that is by Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick called Queer and Now, when she talks about how Christmas is this time that for some people is the feeling of warmth and love and family. And she says it's the time that all of the institutions line up to speak with one voice. I'm paraphrasing, but that's roughly what she says. So like school, even if you go to, a private school, they'll send you home for Christmas. It's a national holiday. The retail institutions are telling you buy for Christmas. It's time to buy things for Christmas. Have you gotten things for Christmas for your family? Banks are closed. Churches are also. So it's like this time of the lining up of institutions that are frequently not actually aligned. And if you perceive yourself as out of step with that alignment, well, that's a really fucking lonely place to be.
And I think what you're saying here, if I can expand on it, like gets at, I think, the rub of this, which is that on the one hand, people like Cattell, right, or some of these early mid-century analysts and therapists who write about the holiday syndrome are trying to define a specific thing that they are encountering in the people that they're seeing as patients. And just, statistically speaking, we can imagine pretty much everyone who's coming into a therapist's office in the period between Thanksgiving and December is going to be like, oh my God, these holidays. It's like, it's in the world. It's a shared thing.
Yeah.
And in that sense, sure, maybe their depression is being intensified around that. But also too, and I love the idea of thinking about this as like a spectrum, that thing that's being identified as a subject population of people with this quote unquote syndrome, which again, it's not in the diagnostic manual.
No.
This is a heuristic thing, right?
Yeah.
It's a way of thinking about it. It's a useful description.
Mm-hmm.
Is those are just people who are having more friction, or at least having friction and the fact of showing up in a psychiatric office to talk about it with this broader condition, which is sort of universal in the culture and which everyone will have some degree of relationship to, whether they want to or not. And in that way, just to tie in a bunch of things that are on the table here, the idea of there being this holiday that, like it or not, you have to identify as upcoming, and you dread it's you see it on the calendar, right? You know it's coming, and you have mixed feelings about it, but you got to deal with it one way or another. Whether you're working in retail, whether you're just, a person who's going to be spending time with your family, or whether you're a clinician who's hearing a lot of people complain about this thing.
Mm-hmm.
It speaks to, like, again, this question of structures and norms and social practices and institutions understood broadly, like how, like not just the institution of psychiatry, but the institution of like the family or the institution of having a holiday, that are things that you are forced to adapt to, or to try to adapt to, or that you wind up failing to adapt to, like it or not. And in that way, well, it sort of follows naturally that another institution that we don't have much choice about is the family, right? As you're born into this, you got to work through it. And I think it's,
like it or not,
there's this combination of both like the second nature of these holidays and the way in which they're both contingent, but also shared in this way, or like they feel inevitable. It's this dread of this thing that's coming that, it's going to be personal but also is collective. It's not directly, there are other contingencies at play here too, right? The contingency about other things you don't have a choice about, right? The contingency of your, say, the religious tradition in which you're raised, or the contingency of your ethnic or racial identification, right? These are other structures that you're born into contingently. And these contingencies are super added, right? So for me, I'll just say this, my birthday happens literally midway between Thanksgiving and Christmas.
I know. And I can never remember your birthday, probably for that reason. Although I do remember it now.
It's okay, babe. You can see how, like, growing up, that might like make you think certain things about, like, oh my God, how are they, or hell, how my parents had to budget this, being like, how we're going to give them gifts for one thing, but not for the other. Like, it's all this type of stuff. Or hell, and I'm thinking here about my brother-in-law, shout out George. His birthday is literally on Thanksgiving, right? And so, like, people are getting together to celebrate this national thing, but also like, what about him? So these are contingencies, right? These are very specific contingencies that are idiosyncratic, but also there is this shared calendar date. And if I could say one more thing here, it's worth invoking the notion of the significance of calendars and the contingencies of our individual experiences and lives with just an eye towards one of the papers that's very much in the background here. They cited Sandor Ferenczi, the Hungarian analyst's work on what he calls the Sunday neuroses.
Yeah.
And the Sunday neuroses, like the case, you've got the...
Picture this in caps, by the way.
Yeah, the Sunday neuroses.
Yeah.
Here's the line from Ferenczi. Sunday is the holiday of present-day civilized humanity. But no one is mistaken if one thinks that a holiday is only significant as a day of physical and psychical rest. And what he's describing there are people who are, come Sunday, you're like, oh my God, this day is already over. It's ruined. I got to go back to the fucking office on Monday. And this is a time, by the way, you don't get Saturdays off either. You only get Sunday, right? No, again, this is contingent. Sunday, like why on earth just that one day, but it's also... try telling the sinking feeling in your stomach that this is just a contingency of capitalism, right? You still got to deal with it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And another way to think
Thanks,
about
Mark Fisher.
or Garfield, right? I hate Monday so much. It's fucking cat. He doesn't have to go to work. Sorry.
You're reminding me of a conversation that I had over and over with my students when I was teaching this intro ethics class. It wasn't really my class. I took it over for a few years, and we would always read John Stuart Mill and from utilitarianism. And there's this famous line about how it's better to be Socrates unsatisfied than a pig satisfied. And the students are always like, yeah, that's totally right. And I'm like, how many of you got up and walked past your sleeping like dogs or cats this morning and were like, I would trade places with you in a heartbeat? And then they're like, wait a minute.
Yeah. Is a way of understanding Sunday neuroses and its relationship to the holiday syndrome the debaucherous joy of pretending that you don't work anymore on Friday night and Saturday is destroyed by the realization on Sunday that you can't pretend anymore. That defense mechanism is off the table. You're not allowed to foreclose on work anymore. Now you have to stare it straight in the face. And therefore you are depressed, you're neurotic, you're whatever
you're
on
anxious.
Sunday. Right. That's the holiday neuroses where the rest of the year you can kind of pretend like your chosen family is your family. It is where you came from. But then around the holidays, the family comes screaming back in your face and you have to deal with it.
This is precisely right. So, and this gets at the way in which thinking about contingency and normality kind of interact in these ways that produce symptoms. And so Ferenczi's argument basically in this is that, well, in order for you to go to work those 5 or 6 other days of the week, you got to repress the impulse not to go to work. You have to do some sort of self-punishment. Like, God damn it, I got to get up and I got to clock in. I got to step over this fucking orange cat or look at my beautiful dog and be like, I have to know I am not that. I got to go.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this one day of the week where society or God or your boss is like, relax. You must relax now. And on the one hand, cool. On the other hand, you have developed 6 out of 7 days, 5 out of 7 days of the week, this habit, this sort of capacity to force yourself to do something. And now you're like, well, am I supposed to force myself to relax? What does it mean to relax? And as Carl Abraham, glossing Ferenczi, describes this, and this is a good line, right? The mental balance which has been maintained with difficulty through working is overturned for the duration of a Sunday, a holiday, or possibly even longer. And Ferenczi describes what happens then when this ongoing work of normalcy, here's an exception to normal. All those mechanisms that you had for navigating that previous period, they don't go away. They come back in what he describes as little neuroses or little hysterias.
Little hysterias.
Yeah,
Self-punishment of masochistic stuff. No, it's Sunday. I got to prepare for work, or I got to spend time with my kids and I got to enjoy it. And to give us a term here that I think is going to be helpful, it's worth leaning on the notion of recreation.
Yeah.
And recreation is both fun, something you're supposed to do, but it's also a recreation.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, what the demand to this is a recreational holiday. This is a time where you get to rest and refresh.
You must recreate.
What it actually does is it reveals the structures that go on in creating the normal and in creating you. And you're given back to that, and those are given back to you. And you have to confront them. So exactly the way you were saying, like, oh, I can spend 11 months of the year not dealing with my parents in the same way or not going back to the place I lived. But now I have the double mind fuck of having to go back. I'll talk about regression shortly.
Yeah, we'll get there.
And what it gives me is the experience of both enjoy this circumstance while pointing to how well I was created in this circumstance. And I have to constantly summon this energy to put myself in relation to it all these other times.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I found this hit like really hard. I mean, I'd vaguely known about the idea of the Sunday neuroses from Ferenczi, but I had not seen so many people cite it in connection, particularly with not only holiday, but with vacation. And, you know, there's got to be something here, and this is not psychoanalysis, but I'm thinking about like state-specific memory. Like you can never remember what it's like to be high until you're high again. Or like you will do better studying for an exam if you study in the same room where you're going to take it, like that kind of thing. So I work 6 days a week, and I take off Fridays, and every Friday, you know, Patrick will know that I'm going to be a little bit hysterical, but I will never remember that until it is actually there. And it's not like I want to work more. I want to take my goddamn Friday off, block it off on Outlook so no one can book me. But some part of me cannot settle. And I think that word is not accidental, right? In this context.
It's worth saying here too that there's some other medical literatures on what's called the holiday syndrome that are coming from non-psychotherapeutic circumstances. There's some stuff about like, actually you can find some literature among like cardiovascular doctors or like hospice care workers or even ER professionals trying to describe the sudden appearance of or intensified presentation of certain maladies or emergencies during this period. And then, of course, there's
increased car accidents, increased suicidality.
Yeah. And there's some literature also pushing back against that empirically. But again, we can think about this in terms of like contingency, the ongoing work of maintaining the normal, and then the difficulty of having to suddenly adapt. And at that point, like, sure, we might be saying like, yes, there are some things that are more likely to happen, say, on the 4th of July, right? If you work at an ER, you're going to have a lot more kids showing up because missing fingers because they were fucking around with M80s. You're probably gonna, if your team wins the Super Bowl, you're going to be pumping a lot more stomachs or something, right? Or like rush week on a frat health center is going to have some particular problems, et cetera. But also, when we think about a lot of things that people associate with their normal life and that involve maintaining willpower, not to like slip back into certain things or not to keep at bay or power down certain distress, right? I mean, you talk to anyone like, I don't know, who works in Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Or is involved in substance abuse situations, right? Like one real danger for people during the holidays is that you'll start drinking again. And I think some of that has to do with a lot of different things that trigger that, you know, in media and advertising, et cetera. But also part of it is like, you have a rhythm, you have a structure. And now suddenly, not only do you have a change in that structure, but you're told you're supposed to enjoy it and you're told you're supposed to not fall apart. And well, there's something understandable and legible about, you know, you've kept sober for the whole period of time and now you got to go back and deal with those people. Or you're alone and you're thinking about the people you lost. And so, yeah, people, well, regress in that sense.
It was very interesting. So one of the more fun parts, well, let's say one of the easier, but also more painful because it involved watching several episodes of Friends, parts of preparing for this episode. Dan and Patrick and I all watched Bob's Burgers Thanksgiving episodes. I watched the one Buffy Thanksgiving episode. And I really took one for the team by watching a whole lot of Thanksgiving episodes of Friends, a show that I have not seen in a very long time. And I remember why I haven't seen it. Although it was actually, since all of Matthew Perry just died and all of the Thanksgiving episodes are about how Chandler's hates Thanksgiving because he was deeply traumatized by an earlier Thanksgiving incident where his parents get divorced and tell him about it at the Thanksgiving table. It actually hits really different in terms of those things. But there was something to this. where the shape of almost every, like, and we're talking like really mainstream television shows. Like we're not talking about like particularly niche anything here. The conceit is always everyone gets together and you're supposed to be happy. And not only something goes wrong, but something familial goes wrong. Often something sexual goes wrong. There is some major familial disturbance. No one feels like they're supposed to, but at the very end, everyone ends up feeling like they're supposed to. There's their return. So there's like, I mean, and part of this is obviously just sort of like the structure of a sitcom or the structure of any sort of television show but you see it doing a certain amount of like reparative work where it's like everybody loves Thanksgiving, reversal, everybody hates Thanksgiving, denouement, Thanksgiving is saved.
Everyone loves to hate Thanksgiving, and we love each other because we all hate Thanksgiving. And that's what the real lesson of Thanksgiving is.
So that's the sort of like the quote unquote like normal holiday syndrome. But now what we get, and I'm thinking about there's only one case study in the original 1955 article. And I want to talk about it a little bit. It's a 24-year-old woman. At the age of 12, she finds her mother after her mother commits suicide. Her father had left home long before that, long before she found her mother. And then he had since been killed in combat. She starts analysis when her last existing family tie, which is with her older sister, starts to become really fraught because of the older sister's marriage. Not clear whether it's like she doesn't like her brother, not specified. So she reports in analysis feeling homeless, quote unquote, allergic to Thanksgiving, after she spends it with her sister's in-laws. And this is going to take us into some of the next articles that are really about regression and specifically about regression to the oral. More on that in a little bit. But she starts playing out more explicitly patterns that pertain to her to her early relation to her father. She's needy, she's anxious, she's quote unquote petulant. Okay, you really get this image of like this little kid, this like in pain young girl. She starts dreaming about her mother's suicide really graphically. And I admit I did not see this part coming. She also reverts to, in dream form, to a pattern of anal masturbation, which had provided her with a certain amount of solace / pleasure between the ages of 5 and 12. And I want to talk about the case study, but I also want to talk about this notion of regression and about what, here's the final quote that I wanted to read from this piece, what determines whether or not this is something that someone will be really affected by. So, quote, the crucial issue is the individual's reaction to these cultural institutions. Sidebar, the cultural institutions here are family, holiday, etc. Okay, back to the quote. The healthier ones are able to respond actively and to achieve a satisfying experience of recreation without negative reverberations. Despite the partial and temporary suspension of the reality principle, they can pursue pleasure, yet maintain reality linkage for practical purposes. The others, often victims of the Sunday neuroses or the holiday syndrome, are inclined to regress more profoundly and in a stereotyped manner, to revive anachronistic experiences and patterns of childhood or their response to these. The most important determining factors in this type of reaction would seem to be the individual's basic potential for integration and his responses in early family relationships and to early environmental vicissitudes. A disruption or gross distortion of the family group apparently facilitates the development of the holiday syndrome and perhaps the Sunday neuroses.
And here again, we have this, I think, a very distinctly psychoanalytic approach to things, right? This idea that our individual reaction to certain events reflects our experiences of previous events where similar things are at stake, or certain themes or meanings are reactivated, or to use our earlier language, recreated. And if there's a sufficient combination of predispositions in the way of earlier traumas, whether they be as, intense as discovering that your mother has killed herself, or as sort of banal and seemingly universal of being like, every single time you're home, oh, I'm actually not home and you can never go back again. That can out in ways that are both unique to you, but that can be described in certain collective terms. And this is where I think we can invoke, to start with, this notion of regression, right? Which is kind of the way Freud actually uses the word regression in German, but it can mean like a going backwards or like a reversion to an earlier form. It also can mean like a withdrawal.
Mm-hmm. We see this in the case studies a lot, where people are sort of like, I feel so alone and isolated that I will isolate myself further.
Yeah. And an image I'm kind of thinking of, I don't know, let's say it's your first I'm presupposing a normative experience here, forgive me, but let's say it's your first Thanksgiving after you have grown up and left the nest, right? Maybe you're in college, maybe you're deployed somewhere, who knows, right? Whatever it is, you are finally going home. And there comes a point where you go back into what used to be maybe your old room, and you realize it's not your old room anymore. Maybe someone's using it as a workspace, or as like another sibling has taken it over. Or maybe it is your old room, and you lay down in that bed where you're sleeping now, even though it's your bed, but it's not really your bed. And you're looking at, I don't know, a poster that you have on the wall that you put up when you were a teen. And you've just had a fight with your family members that is not like necessarily identical to a fight you would have had as a teenager, but like now you're using college vocabulary for it, but also you're as upset as you were as a kid.
Yep.
And you're just laying in that bed, and you're like, oh my God, you have like a Proustian moment where you doze off and you wake up, you're like, oh my God, am I 17 again? What am I doing here? Or maybe you're like, oh shit, I don't know if I can go out and eat another course. I needed a breather. Is that dude who sells AIDS still around? Because like what I used to do when I was 16 was I'd sneak a quick J, and then I'd be able to eat, and also would put a thick layer of getting stoned between me and all this noxious stimulus. Like you literally find yourself like reaching for these regressing, going back to these previous moments of adaptations or maladaptations that at least had some function for you back then.
Mm.
And now, because you've, entered this moment where certain conditions are being recreated and certain feelings of alienation are both being recreated, but also new kinds of alienation are arriving, you reach for those things almost instinctively, reflexively.
My favorite description of regression was think about the topography of psychic structure. And regression is a return of your childhood mental topography. Leaving the family is about tearing down certain peaks, building up new peaks, like originating identity. The work that you do there and then going back home, all those old peaks come back and all the new ones kind of get torn down. And it is that as being like a metaphor for what regression, how that plays out. Because I think that also ties into like the abusive uncle, the overfeeding mother. Like they're all doing the same thing once you're back in that set and setting, once you're around all those different people.
Yeah. There's a powerful case to be made, and I actually think, Patrick, I'm going to ask you to make it in some ways, that the whole setting of Thanksgiving, including the food. Thank you to my colleague, Nathan Ryan, who gave us an article that points out, among many other things, that most of the food at Thanksgiving is functionally baby food. It has the texture of baby food. So not only are you, potentially, like if it's your first Thanksgiving after leaving a natal family, are you regressing with relation to the family system and to your adaptive and or maladaptive behaviors for dealing with it. People are literally doing things like wearing specific pants so that, like, they can stuff themselves so full. You can read this in this sort of traditional way as like the abundance of the harvest. And like, that's not wrong. But there's also something going on here about the focus on the oral. I mean, and we could go in a lot of different directions with this. I mean, I would certainly think about, and I'm thinking also about a conversation that we recorded that is not out yet, but will be out next month with philosopher Kate Mann about diet culture and fat phobia. And I think I was reading a piece by Virginia Soul-Smith the other day, the author of Fat Talk, who was like, isn't it interesting that, we have this huge family holiday that is totally organized around feeding people, and where people get really offended often if you don't eat. It's taken as a personal assault that is also a site for family who you often haven't seen in a year to comment on bodies, often negatively, with respect to like, oh, you've been eating too much throughout the rest of the year. Now stuff yourself.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, let's say, mixed messages that are happening here. But Patrick, I think you wanted to kind of set the scene for some of the things that happen at an American Thanksgiving, so that we can talk about them in their own right. So that in the second half of this episode, we can talk about this as in relation to what Freud, following earlier anthropologists, will talk about as the totem meal. And so that we can look at this other essay about the holiday syndrome, about symptoms and dreams in relationship to it.
So here's what I want to do now. And first, I want to plug these two articles if people want to check them out, right? The first one is this article by Gene Rosenbaum, which was actually delivered at the Midwinter Analytic in 1960. It's called Holiday Symptom and Dream. And it's an attempt to...
It's really good.
Yeah, let's understand. Let's use Freudian theory to specifically think about the holiday syndrome as it applies to what happens at the quintessential 1960s, 1950s Thanksgiving, right? The second one is the one that Nathan hooked us up with, and I really want to recommend this one too, which is also cheeky, but really there's a lot there, called We Gather Together, Consumption Rituals of Thanksgiving Day. It's by Melanie Wallendorf and Eric Arnold, and it's from a Journal of Consumer Research in 1991. And I gotta want to just say this just upfront about this. We may be like, oh, vulgar psychoanalysis. This is so goofy. This is so funny. Intelligent people don't actually think in terms of like penises or all this stuff. And then you like read actual advertising industry stuff or consumer products, and they're like, no, absolutely get a woman in a cocktail gown, put her in that sports car, and have her crank the shift a lot. And you're like, okay, that actually moves product. Like, so the people
it's just like, I mean, I was rereading Totem and Taboo and reading various other, like in the Dream Symptom, the Rosenbaum article. It's like, the turkey, an obviously phallic bird. And I'm like, is it though?
Yeah.
Is it? And then, I mean, well, I guess so. It's got a fucking long neck. Like, sure. It's no wilder than exactly what we're seeing in this sort of glimpse into thinking about marketing. And, worth, sidebar, but like worth noting that Freud's nephew basically was the creator of public relations. Anyway, that's another episode.
The other thing I want to say about these two papers and why we're reading them together is whereas Rosenbaum is like, here's this holiday, let's read psychoanalytic theory into it or see what we find. The Wallendorf and Arnold paper it's an empirical study. They got a whole bunch of college kids to go home for Thanksgiving. They were like, what do you see? Take photos.
Yeah, they were participant observers.
And then they coded that and they found certain themes. And emerging from what they observed was stuff that's very strongly psychoanalytic. And with that in mind, then I want to ask you all some questions, but I'm hoping some of our listeners can also like see if any of these things track with their own experiences of Thanksgiving.
Yeah, for sure.
And if so, please leave us a voicemail or comment on it, because I think there could be some cool stuff here.
Or a note on Patreon.
All right, let's talk about the Thanksgiving ritual.
All right. Are you the patriarch in this room?
I think so.
Yes, I am. So first,
that seems very important to everybody here. I mean, not here in the text, not here in this room.
Yeah. So here we go.
That is like the verbal equivalent of you scratching your balls.
Jesus Christ. I'm
Gross.
Just spread my legs really wide and knock over my... Okay, no. All right.
He's in a bathrobe for everybody listening.
Yeah.
Oh my
Please, it's a
God.
smoking jacket, okay? Please, it's a smoking jacket, and I'm having a Winston, which tastes good the way a cigarette should. It's the number one doctor-recommended cigarette.
Good for your throat.
There's something different about Thanksgiving. It's more than just a holiday.
None of this is true. Don't picture that. He's wearing a technical t-shirt just like every other day.
Yeah, it's a sensory thing. Anyways, who cooks?
Mom.
Women.
Women.
Yes.
Or the matriarch, the host. Yeah.
Yeah, the matriarch.
Yeah, but this is also a time of training for younger members of the family. But there's major gender divisions in this.
Yeah.
Women very much in the kitchen, men watching football.
Women do the cooking.
Yeah.
And I want to read you one little bit here when they note the...
And if they don't, and if men do, they really act like they're doing something super, super special.
Delightful. Okay, so squaring with the empirics in the Journal of Consumer Research paper, they note, women generally seem to do most of the cooking. They start cooking very early, if not a day or two before, particularly if you're doing something like making a pie crust. However, this is something that they noted that the students themselves, both men and women, may have underreported. A second phenomenon likely to be underreported is that the female host or mom who will not sit down. And so not only do the women cook, they spend a lot of the meal getting up
Serving.
from the chair.
Mm-hmm.
That tracks with my experience. A lot of shuffling.
If men do cook, what's one aspect of the meal, if there is cooking, they're going to be associated with cooking it? What's that?
The bird and carving it.
Yeah, no, it's true for my life too.
The totem animal.
Yeah.
I'm not saying in my
Bob's
family.
Burgers.
My mother did all of the cooking. I mean, I helped, obviously.
The turkey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't eat meat, so I didn't do the turkey.
You're supposed to respect the food. You understand? Slice it in an appetizing manner.
And the turkey may be a thing that they very specifically take a type of ownership over, right? I'm going to brine it the night before, right? Or I'm going to do X. I'm going to put this particular rub on it. Or
wait, now we're really into like the super like male coded way of cooking a Thanksgiving turkey is to deep fry it, to the point where when I went to our local Wegmans the other day, there were like a deep frying like kit for like how to like submerge your turkey. But
and kill your uncle while you're doing it.
Talk about another one of those like holiday syndrome things, like people dropping a frozen turkey into a deep fryer and getting like shrapnel, like building a barrel bomb in their backyard. Yeah.
Oh, that happened at an episode of Gilmore Girls.
Damn.
There's a deep fried turkey situation.
We'll, you're deep in the realm of a cultural pathology where like the Consumer Products and Safety Commission or whatever it is has to produce videos every year of like, don't fucking do this.
Yeah.
And, we get that on both July 4th and on Turkey Day.
Both civic holidays.
So the turkey, right? Now note, again, this is also empirically validated, right? Yeah, the man is generally, the patriarch, the oldest man is generally involved with the turkey. Now, even if he isn't the one responsible for cooking it,
he's responsible for carving it.
Yeah. Or he takes it out of the oven.
Because it represents him. Spoiler. Sorry, you can't spoil a book that's 100 years old.
Well, or it represents him in the Freudian sense, and we'll get there, but also,
we'll get there. Second part.
It represents a certain masculine role, right? Mm-hmm. We don't want to be as glib as like, well, the woman brings out the cranberry sauce and she's like the foraging gatherer and he's the hunter. But
no, that shit is the blood. That's what this article told us. And especially that one year when there was a cranberry shortage, they suggested, what was it? Cherry.
Yeah, something
but
else
it had to be blood colored. Obviously some of this is also about tartness and whatnot, but also it is 100% about the blood of the sacrifice.
So the patriarch wields the knife, the patriarch hefts the meat, and that's like the centerpiece of the meal. He is the centerpiece of it. Mm-hmm. His work of slicing and penetrating or stuffing it, whatever. He's all over it.
Phrasing.
Okay, Teddy, Thanksgiving is the most important meal of the year, which makes the turkey like the king of foods.
Here he comes, right?
Yep, the king.
Okay.
All right,
Got
and
it.
the trick is with the rubs is to go under the skin.
Yep.
All right, so you start at the bottom.
Yeah.
And then you massage in the rub and gently make your way to the neck.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh.
Think of the meat as the canvas and the rub as the paint.
A lot of metaphors, Bobby.
You know what? I'm already doing it, so I'll just finish.
Just as a sidebar here, a lot of literature by nutritional anthropologists about how in quote-unquote hunter-gatherer societies, the extent to which those still exist and observed, traditionally the literature has been all about the men doing the hunting, right? And you will even get into the early 2000s, people being like, oh yeah, the men are bringing in all these calories, right?
It's like a pathetically small amount.
Yeah,
in comparison.
It's actually turns out that the bulk of the calories are the tubers or like the little fruits or whatever that the women prepare. And moreover, a major scandal in anthropology journals, I forget when specifically this was that some people doing these very specific calorie countings were literally excluding the calories that infants were getting from breastfeeding to overstate the production and contribution of men, right? So whether it's the men or outside the house, like get them the fuck out of our sort of like village so that they're not fucking with things or they're standing over us and telling us how we have to do things. In any event, we're going to elevate their position, right? We're going to center what they do. Okay. So at that point, then I want to just ask, who sits where? Who gets if you have a table that has a head? Who's at the head of the table?
The papa.
Dad.
The papa. Sorry, that I just put on a little fiddler on the roof.
The papa.
It's the papa. It's the papa. Yeah. Like it could be it's the oldest patriarch, or it's the dad. It's the quote unquote the founder of the feast.
The founder of the feast.
And we're getting a lot of stuff about fathers and founders of feasting. Just flag that for later in this episode, but also very much for the next one.
Yeah, and if she sits, mom sits closest to the kitchen.
Yeah.
Yep. I felt personally seen, attacked, implicated by the one case study in this Journal of Consumer Research where they're like, a Polish immigrant mother was constantly moving and feeding people. So much so that people had to be like, no, you have to sit down and eat some of this food. Please stop eating in the kitchen while you are preparing it. And I was like, okay. Now, I should also ask, like, does everyone sit at the same table if it's a big enough group?
There's a kids' table.
The kids get their own little table. And, as you're growing up, the indignity of having to sit, but mom, I'm 12. Why should I sit with these 6-year-olds? Or finally, this is the first Thanksgiving where I can sit at the grown-ups table, right? And they're going to pour you a little bit of that like apple sparkling cider, and you get to, do that or sneak a bit of champagne or whatever it is. Like in other words, what I'm getting at, now we're moving on to the question of social roles and this theme of inclusion. Right. So note, who gets invited? Who populates our Thanksgiving dinner? Who's supposed to be there? Who may or may not be there? Whose presence has to be negotiated?
I mean, kin, I suppose. If we're in this language of we're in anthropology, we're temporarily outside of our lane to venture into anthropology.
Blood relatives first, and then like boyfriends and girlfriends if they're serious, and especially like fiancés, engaged partners, and stuff like that if they're serious. That's like it's more than a date. If you're bringing your girlfriend to Thanksgiving, that's like a proper introduction. Yeah.
It's a big deal.
And there's also something here about like people who don't have somewhere else to go. That's important.
Yeah.
Right. So there's blood family. There's potential for future members of the family that might intermarry. We're obviously talking in like exceptionally heteronormative terms here.
Absolutely.
That's on purpose. Okay.
Yeah,
that's weird because that's like what is the literature is about, but also because holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas are one of the major sites of creating and maintaining heteronormativity. Okay, so that's just to be really clear. Like we're doing that on purpose.
But to build on this point, though, it does feel like to choose to engage with Thanksgiving with chosen family is as emotionally important a step as choosing to include a person who is publicly saying, I want into your family.
Yes.
They're both intentional.
Right? Yeah, for sure. And Friendsgiving is a real thing.
They're special. Friendsgiving's great.
That happens, but is probably, one could say, in some ways in reaction to holiday syndrome, right? You have the traumatic encounter with natal family, and then you need to recuperate from it by saying, you can't wait till New Year's, so you need to have Friendsgiving.
Yeah.
So just to summarize this, then, right? We are talking about from the seating to the food preparation. We're talking about a structure, right? And it's a structure of not just like bringing the family or the quote unquote extended family, which is sometimes called a clan in some of the literature, or even occasionally it's rather unfortunately and overdeterminedly referred to as like the tribe, right? They're all brought together.
Well, I mean, it's like the people who are reading 19th century anthropology and some 19th century like armchair anthropology.
Yeah. So everyone's brought together and it's like, this is who we are. We are here. And again, I want to like invoke
reinstates that we.
Yes,
absolutely.
This is the idea of, again, psychodynamic stuff or the work going into the holiday versus the otherwise. It's about not just ratifying something that was created at one point. It speaks to the continual work of recreating
maintenance.
This. Yeah.
It's maintenance. That's the ugly. I mean, recreation is like the nice sort of way to say it, but I would say it like sustains and maintains this thing that we call the natal family
and thus
the extended family.
And thus this particular effort that's put on, you're bringing your girlfriend from college. This must be very important. Oh, you say you're just friends and they have nowhere to go. Come on, there must be something else going on there, right?
Or this is the time where if you are a queer kid coming home from college and your grandma is like, oh, haven't you met a nice boy? So it's this time where cultural norms, often deeply conservative cultural norms, are maintained and upheld.
Yeah.
Right?
Like, no, grandma, this is just my roommate. Right. Or any variation of that. I mean, hell, I know kids who were gay who would bring home like a friend who was a woman, and it was kind of implied that like, look, please just cover me on this situation. Right. So again, these roles, the social roles are very much there. It's also, I just want to flag here, right, that there's this idea that, we'll talk more about this later, but this idea that one of the themes of this holiday, apart from just being like, this is abundance, and we have abundance and togetherness, which we demonstrate by giving us superabundance, is it's all coded about being equality, right? It's like we're all together, we gather together, right? It's to use quote Rosenbaum, it's one of the few holidays which can include people of every religion, race, and creed. And hell, in the armed services, another one of these laboratories for fostering social bonds, right? Every attempt is made to supply even the most distant outpost with turkey. All must partake of the bird, right? And think if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, you're like, no, I don't want this. No, you have to eat it, right?
Yeah, it's the fucking worst holiday.
So,
sorry.
No, this is fair. That's also, again, like we're describing a structure while we
all
have
I can
odds
eat
with
is
an
the
issue
mashed
of it.
potatoes.
Yeah. And occasionally you have people who are just like in town, right? There's a line actually that came up in the Cattell. Sorry, one second. I wanted to quote this one note where it's like sometimes you bring in someone else, right? Someone who is a friend from work or who's traveling, right? Or we'd have a priest occasionally who was, a friend of the family, and they were of course very welcome. But it was also the case sometimes that there might be a little bit of a masochistic or like even a sadistic aspect to it.
To the hosting of someone from outside the family?
Yeah, right.
How so?
Well, this idea that, and this is the flip side of the family syndrome, where there's often an underlying of masochistic self-commiseration blended with an urge to find an even more pitiable, homeless character than oneself.
That's a quote from the Cattell piece.
Yeah. We're bringing in Dad's friend from work because something's going on with his family and we're not going to talk about it, right? Or we're bringing in this tragic, think about, what's the name of Linda's sister on Bob's Burgers?
Gail.
Oh,
yeah.
With all her cats and why she has to be there.
She's big in the Thanksgiving episodes.
It's special since we're having Teddy, Mort, and your Aunt Gail over. I don't see why Gail and her cats have to stay with us all week.
She had to vacate a place because of the fire, Bob. She put her dental dams in the dryer.
What are dental dams?
Nothing.
Forget it.
Don't say it at school.
Didn't she used to only have one cat?
She adopted one last week, and then she found one on her way over here. She's a cat magnet.
Oh, it was so sad. He was just sitting on someone's porch.
Now, it's also noted here, too, that in the cases, though, of these fictive kin that are brought in, oftentimes the conversations involve them behaving sort of like they're actually proving they're members of the family. You're doing a great job, young man. How about I give you a job interview? But note, too, the emphasis on people in particular social roles or who are changing roles. The pregnant woman, the person who's about to get married. It's very much about being their inclusion or their integration. What do people talk about or what happens in terms of interactions at Thanksgiving?
Well, according to the Sarah Satin piece that we read, siblings fight. Hostile family dynamics are at work.
Politics.
Yeah.
Politics, religion.
All the no-nos come out.
It's when you've got the person there. Again, like think about the cottage industry of articles that are like, how do you talk to your uncle? It's always a fucking uncle, right? It's like the idea of like the Dutch uncle, I guess, is one trope of this. How do you deal with this one person whose only way of relating to you is through this thing? And they're going to keep pushing you and pushing you and pushing you, right? How do you negotiate this?
I wanted to say, in this, I think we can bring in some of the parts of Rosenbaum that are important here while still working with your example, is that one thing that I want to make sure we get on the table pretty soon is that, and this is the piece that Patrick was talking about that was delivered to the Midwest psychoanalytic, is Rosenbaum says, and this is a quote that distills the thesis of this piece: the holiday permits a regression to the oral level, and this oral regression is used as a defensive expression of predominantly Oedipal conflicts. So this is at work, certainly, when we're talking about the founder of the feast, the patriarch, etc. But it's also in conflict with intergenerational conflicts. Okay, it doesn't have to be literal. But this is, I think, really important when we are talking about the idea of children regressing when they go home. But adults regress also. There's regression all around. Everyone gets turkey, everyone gets regression. It's specifically regression to this oral stage, right? Everything, all of the food is soft. Everyone of every generation, whether or not you still have teeth or not, or whether you haven't even grown teeth yet because you're a baby, can partake of these foods in such abundance that they all, in all of their mushiness, kind of mingle together on the plate. They can be eaten by anyone. But the thing that this oral regression permits is a sort of covering over while simultaneously expressing these Oedipal conflicts within a family. So everyone's happy, everyone's smiling, everyone's like, I'm so full that it hurts, but also everyone's fighting. And those two things are both true.
I'll gloss this just for the sake of some of our listeners, right? This notion of like an oral stage or orality. We'll talk about this in the standard edition when we get to it, right? But there's
that's
this
like 5 years away.
This is like an embodied metaphor in some ways, or it's both a specific technical term, but also an evocative metaphor that can only be understood in relation to other metaphors, right?
Yes.
But orality is understood as the most primitive way of relating to pleasure, but also to objects in the world, right?
Sucking, for instance.
Yeah, and the template image of it is the child sucking on the mother's breast, like the infant, right? The nursling infant. And there are themes here of like, if we were to expand it metaphorically, like taking in all you can, or sometimes even cannibalizing something, eating everything, right? But it's about like need. And it's also something that we stimulate. And this is part of why Freud uses this language. There are mucous membranes in the mouth that are very pleasurable.
Yeah.
Right? This is Freud's, like the line, well, just sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Well, my man, no, he's enjoying playing with his lips, right? Or like if you ever smoked, part of the difficulty of giving it up is the pleasure of having something in your lips. So put a toothpick in there, right? So this is the earliest mode of both consuming and relating, and it's a certain type of pleasure. Now, there are other subsequent ones which map on in the Freudian model to different types of development and to basically the way in which different sites of pleasure, or we learn to regulate embodiment and processes of consumption and excretion and pleasure and emission, if you want to use those languages, that are mapped on to what becomes the anal, right? Which is all about retention, holding out, giving out, right? Learning how to potty train. Right. And of course, it sounds weird. Like, what pleasure could there possibly be in that? Well, we had the anal masturbation case earlier, but also think about how you encourage a child to potty train, right? You make them like, you have to you feel bad right now, give it out, right, etc. And then the final one is the genital, right, which is related. It's the most quote unquote relatively sophisticated one, and involves relationships of substitution and exchange. So you're already a little more integrated than the child who's shitting themselves or the child who's constantly sucking on something. You're capable of being like, this is my object. I can choose this person versus this person. In other words, the genital stage is associated with Oedipal relations. And Oedipal relations are basically power dynamics in a triadic mode in the family. So just to think about this for 1 second, when it comes to the process of eating in the family, let's say there's this phenomena of what's sometimes called the hush, which is the silence that falls over the family as they talk, or as they stop talking and they just start focusing on eating. If you may have a hush at your Thanksgiving, because when does it happen? Stay tuned to this, right? But also too, like, think about some of the ways in which, I don't know, let's say you see that uncle. It's always an uncle. I don't know why that is. The uncle who you haven't seen since you were a toddler or a teenager is like, wow, when I last saw you, you were still shitting yourself. And you're like, well, thanks, man. I'm 18 and this is my girlfriend, but cool, dude. You know, you're like, he's big dicking you in this way, right? And it's all about this genital, Oedipal, like phallic dominance display. And you're like, okay. And maybe he'll give you a little more sophisticated. He'll be like, wow, I remember when you were a kid who really used to like cowboy and Indian movies, but now you're all woke, right? And what he's basically trying to do is like goad you into having a childlike tantrum to prove that you actually haven't changed that much, because that's where he needs you to be.
This uncle is in the throes of regression himself to be doing this to you.
Yes. He's like, oh my God, this kid is getting older. I'm going to die. I'm anxious about this. I can't connect with the youth. I used to be the young one. Yes.
Right.
He's in his Oedipal anxieties there too, right?
Yeah.
I want to go back to orality here and say, and now I'm thinking in particular about this article from Sarah Satin that Patrick Wood and I were talking about before. It's called Psychodynamics of the Holiday Syndrome, and it is the one that is about schizophrenic patients in group. This has a phrase in it that I think is so helpful in understanding what, for anyone who's not deeply committed to psychoanalytic language, I think can be less persuasive, which is to say, like, this is all about oral regression. And the way that Satin glosses this is by saying, look, this is about your dependency needs. And I think that phrase is really helpful. And you can, regardless of your psychoanalytic commitments or lack thereof, I think you can see this idea as like, okay, not only are you and your asshole uncle simultaneously and in relation to each other regressing, but you're doing it as everyone is not only eating, but overeating. Okay. So this is a time when everyone has collectively relaxed our strictures on how much you eat. And it also means, and this goes back to Patrick's talking about the sort of paradigmatic image of the oral, which is to say the baby at the breast. We also, and I think this gets to the heart of why the holidays can be so painful, we also relax our strictures on how much we can want, how much we can desire. We dream of total abundance and it's manifest on the table, but we also, and so the actual abundance, if you are lucky enough to experience that, is there on the table. It's real. You can eat it. You eat it till it hurts. But we also allow ourselves to dream of endless love. We allow ourselves to dream of endless material comfort, but just unconditional, endless love. And Sarah Satin says, despite or perhaps because of the joyful nature of these holidays, few people live through them without at least some sadness, disappointment, anxiety, and emotional pain. Because the oral phase, the oral stage is a time when the boundaries between self and other are not firmly fixed, when, if you are lucky, you can get all you need and more, and where the sort of radical breach between what you want and what you can have, like that severing has not yet occurred. And so there's something I think fundamentally painful about this idea of like the table that is groaning with food and that abundance that has been made manifest. It's visible. You share it, you pass it around. And so the fantasy of that feeling of uninterrupted continuous connection with your relatives seems like it's more in reach than it's ever been. And yet the family collectively regresses, and there's always going to be, however coded it is, there are going to be shots fired. There's going to be tension. There's going to be fraughtness. And so the puncturing or the rupture of a fantasy is more painful than not having the fantasy itself.
I think that's hard to sit with, but it's very wise. And I think it gets at this dynamic of recreation and creation. A lot of creation, well, we have creation myths, and we'll talk about this a lot more next week. But also we have stories about people coming together, right? And hell, part of what is told at Thanksgivings a lot are experiences of previous Thanksgivings. Remember that Thanksgiving when? And sometimes those are funny, particularly if it's a Thanksgiving fail. But other times it's really nasty. Like, remember the Thanksgiving when you threw a tantrum? Or remember Thanksgiving with your ex-wife who is so much better than you? How'd you lose that? Like that type, like people do that type of shit, right? Yep. But there's also this way in which underlying them all is this kind of, or possibly underlying them all, is this desire to recreate something that maybe you never actually had.
Yeah, well, that's
right?
what nostalgia is, right?
Yeah.
But it's nostalgia at this level that is not, I mean, it's simultaneously cultural nostalgia that is mandated.
Yeah.
And it's also that individual nostalgia for wholeness.
Yes. And the feeling that like we're in this moment where we're all together, we're brought together, we should feel as one and like a whole, but actually we suddenly feel alone. And there's like a hole in us that's bottomless. And practically speaking, sure, we can read these cheeky lines that are about how like literally the food is all mashed up into pap, right? It's baby food. And adults dress like children with like elastic. The line is like you wear clothing that can seamlessly transition between mealtime to playtime to nap time without changing.
Sidebar, one of the Thanksgiving episodes of Friends has Joey vowing to eat an entire turkey, and he puts on Phoebe's maternity pants to do it.
This is the other thing.
That's
too.
why I watch these fucking things. So
A non-trivial
Payoff.
A non-trivial number of these empirical things also note a whole lot of men, like the ritual of unbuttoning your belt, being like blah, like Rosemary has a line even being like,
could you make that noise again?
Blah. The symptom of like. It's like, you know, like irritability or like gassiness, indigestion, etc.
They all talk about that. They all talk about gastrointestinal, like this is gastrointestinal pain, self-inflicted collective gastrointestinal pain.
Yeah, talk about masochism, right? But also like a non-trivial number of these people, of men specifically, will start talking about how they feel pregnant suddenly,
Yeah,
right? Or they'll get more like graphic about like the damage that they're going to do to the bathroom or whatever. But it really is a regression. But also too, just to think for 1 second about like functionally speaking, you have this Oedipal regressive dynamic with a family member. Let's first in the example, it's the uncle who's like, again, my Y uncles, but the uncle who's coming in to put you in your place. Well, what can you do? You can interrupt him and say what is always you're supposed to say. Mom, this turkey is amazing. Or Dad, please tell us about the different substances that you rubbed onto this animal, right? And so the food is like this object for literally, I'm sorry, I'm not doing this Oedipal stuff in terms of the fighting. Let's talk about the oral. Or very practically, you can't speak with your mouth full. So you just keep eating and then that's the hush, right? That falls. Everyone's something has been said that literally shouldn't be said or can't be metabolized. So now let's all eat. And I think there's something going on here too with this idea of like all the things that are constitutive in the family of like the love that you wish you'd received or the love that you couldn't receive or the people who aren't there to receive your love or just all these dynamics. You put all that yearning into just over consuming, whether punishing yourself or the desire just to take it in. This is the one time in which these people who are otherwise difficult to me, and maybe they are even being difficult to me simultaneously, right? But at least I can eat their love, right? This is oral regression on a very basic level.
Yeah.
Like they made you think like, oh, you've lost so much weight in college or you've gained so much weight in college. Either way, I'm making fun of you.
I'm going to feed you.
I'm going to feed you. Take in my love even as I do this. Also, like there's more granular stuff you can do and think about here that's interesting about the way in which this meal is different, right? For example, unlike other meals, which are served generally in staggered courses, part of the whole idea with Thanksgiving is, well, maybe you have a soup or something to begin with, but then all that shit comes out at once,
The table groans.
Yeah, which is, by the way, a venerable phrase in particularly Anglo-Saxon culture. Like that's in Beowulf and stuff. Like the boards of the table groan. We have superabundance. It's
I'm
also
so impressed you managed to work Beowulf into this conversation.
What can I say? I'm a classy guy.
What was that sound you made when you unbuckled your belt?
Sorry. People, I mean, look, people also show off Oedipally at Thanksgiving or on podcasts, but that's another matter. What I'm going to say too, though, on this point, like, is like even like the way things are served, right? Like a lot of other meals, you're supposed to separate different things, right? Part of maybe what sometimes is delicious about Thanksgiving, and also why, like, maybe I don't know if like you're not a fan of like the quote unquote garbage plate, right? Or you don't like
your food's to touch.
Your food's to touch. On Thanksgiving, they're supposed to touch. You're supposed to get that cranberry sauce onto that stuffing, etc.
It's the best part.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And
everything gets gravy. Everything gets a sheet of gravy.
Covered in fat. And the themes too of like stuffing and overloading, right? The turkey is stuffed. The potatoes are loaded with like butter, but also maybe the sweet potatoes loaded with gravy or with marshmallows, etc. Like, and then people themselves get stuffed. We're in the realm of the oral. Boundaries are very... everything is overflowing through this logic of superabundance. So we could talk more about this. And I do want to say, just with an eye towards something that Abby said earlier about the way in which Thanksgiving leads into Christmas. But there is this kind of delightful line in the Consumer Research article, which I wanted to read, where they use the phrase, just to gloss this, it's important, of like the epigenetic. And that just, for here, doesn't mean like epigenetic drama or stuff that's literally encoded, but the idea of layered events that build upon the meaning of previous events, right? It's a recapitulation of structures. But this is the line. Thanksgiving Day is the cultural equivalent in the ritual calendar of Freud's oral stage of development in an individual's life. Epigenetically, Thanksgiving Day as oral stage must precede rituals that occur later in the American ritual calendar. Greed and retentiveness are culturally negotiated at Christmas, as hedonic sexual fulfillment on New Year's Eve. In this way, the ritual calendar annually takes the culture through oral, anal, and genital stages of development before completing the holiday season and returning the culture to the everyday world of adult instrumentality. Namely,
which is New Year's.
Yes. Get loaded up on oral stuff with your family, then give and receive and compare gifts in an anal mode on Christmas with your family, and then finally go out and
get
pop those fuzzy bottles.
And,
watch the big ball
kiss someone
drop.
you've never met.
Kiss a stranger, get laid, wake up, regret it. And then what do you do in January?
You stop eating.
Yeah.
Sorry. Wait. No, is it we're not supposed to say that?
Well, you do repression. You're like, I'm going to go to the gym
in
every day.
Januaries, we do repression.
Yeah, that's when you do adult management of those impulses that you previously let go. But of course, as we've learned from Ferenczi and the holiday syndrome, or on the Sunday Neurosis, right? And as we learn about holiday syndrome, all that like letting go also takes work, and there are consequences to it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So hopefully if we have succeeded, estranged a little bit your relationships to this holiday, made it uncanny, as it were. And before we close today and we tell you where we're headed for our second installment of Thanksgiving, the episode, we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the paradoxes of this holiday.
So what a lot of holidays do, ritual holidays, right, which both make no sense when you talk about them in the ways that we have, and I think we have estranged them, but they also seem inevitable and seem to make all the sense in the world.
Yeah.
In the way that we're subjectivized into them, taught about them, experienced, is they reconcile opposites and they bring them together. We're in other words, at the realm of the uncanny, right? Mm-hmm. At your home Thanksgiving meal, there's all this stuff that if you think about it too long, you're not going to feel so at home anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And maybe we could just like run through just very quickly those paradoxes. There's a lovely line from Cattell about this.
So Cattell says, there's paradoxical emphasis on conforming obedience, special expressions of interest, tenderness, and belonging on the one hand, with unusual license and magical expectations on the other.
So we have that paradox there, right? Of like, relax. Do all this work to then relax. or the paradox of like mom cooks a meal, everyone has gastrointestinal issues afterwards, but that's not the failure of the meal. That's a successful meal.
That's the purpose of the meal.
Right.
Yeah. It's the mark of success.
Another
is if you're sick.
Is if you're sick. Yeah. Like, another paradox of this might be that like it's a holiday that celebrates coming together and equality. But as we've already seen, that equality and celebration of peace and being grateful for one another is also marked by a whole lot of fighting, a lot of feelings of loneliness sometimes. And even as it's sort of like, you're all equivalent, we're all equal here. This is about sharing. There's actually a lot of both oversharing and a lot of enforcement of social hierarchies.
Yeah, I was going to say jockeying for and reinforcement of those hierarchies.
There's some additional things that go on here in terms of like the coexistence of opposites. So one thing that also happens in this Thanksgiving meal, right, is that supposedly the food's very plain, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's all these like tubers and stuff.
In the Wallendorf and Arnold thing, they're all like, it's all like baked, mashed, boiled, right? And there's this nice line about how it's served on like your fancy china, but you don't serve fancy food on it.
Nope.
It's plain food on fancy china.
And it's also food sometimes where like the best stuff is like, it's that butterball, right? It's the turkey from Popeyes. It's that canned cranberry sauce. But you are very studious about removing the labels from everything, right? And one of the differences that happens that they note in terms of class situations is the higher class you are, the more aspirationally higher class you want to be, the more you'll make sure that the food is, even if it is from a store, to be presented as though it's from scratch. There's some light aura of, I made this specially just for you, or I used a crust, but the stuff inside it, I made myself. It's the emphasis on singularity of effort over and against
generic
commodification.
Yeah. And then there's also the sort of the contrast of the abundant. We've talked a lot about like the groaning table with also this emphasis on thrift, on like everyone gets Tupperwares to take home.
Don't waste anything.
And then, different families have different, like, what are you going to do with the rest of this turkey? But, is it going to be an open-faced turkey sandwich, or are you going to make a turkey? And then, the paper will always have like all these things to do with your leftover, so that becomes a problem in and of itself too. But it's also these like little mini kind of aftershocks of the feast, right? That can also finally be enjoyable once the expectations of the actual feast have been met. Like you can enjoy the food sometimes when you don't have to have it with the family.
Do you want to hear that quote from that article?
Please.
Through the careful wrapping of the leftover food, the early American belief in frugality is dramatized. It is curious that the encasing of leftovers in plastic is done near a waste can filled with packaging from the purchased food products. Packaging waste is tolerated, while wasting food is not.
And this is one of those things that is both seemingly obvious and straightforward, but when you think about it for more than a minute, you're like, oh my God, right? This actually generates a ton of mess. This is going to produce a ton of excess and garbage. God forbid you have to do the dishes after this. This is so much unnecessary labor. Think about like the way, talk about tables groaning, your plumbing is going to be groaning, right? There's a lot of like rough externalities to this dressed up in this logic of, well, these are very simple foods and this is a simple experience. And that combination of like simplicity with over the top, well, we could call it overloaded or overdetermined, like a turducken of meaning even is.
Ew.
Turducken's delicious.
I've never said ew so much as on this
turducken.
episode.
I've made so many of those.
Ew.
Oh, goddamn.
No, I was ewing your turducken of meaning.
With sausage between the layers. Oh God, it's perfect.
You're gonna have a heart attack.
Well, speaking of that, what you were getting at earlier about like the rebranding of packaged foods as being made from scratch, or imagining that this like very consumerist holiday actually came from our hearts and not from a mass killing floor in some like butcher shop someplace or whatever. There is also something to be said about the act of your matriarch or patriarch handing you a Tupperware thing of leftovers. The positionality of the role of provider and provision and who's being provided for also plays into this, right? It's all still reifying all these roles and positions.
I love this phrase that you used too. I think it's absolutely spot on, which is this idea of here's a celebration of peace, prosperity, and togetherness, which is also downstream from and dependent upon the outputs of like a mass killing floor or like a slaughterhouse, like the charnel house there. And I think that's maybe a nice way for us to cue where we're kind of going to be going.
Oh, yeah. This was the uplifting half of this 2-part series.
Yeah. So Wallendorf and Arnold have this line where they both describe Thanksgiving in terms of maybe paradoxical, but also have like a lot of paradoxes, the coherence of an underlying unconscious motivation.
Yeah.
Right. Thanksgiving Day celebrations both mark and prove to participants their ability to meet basic needs amply through consumption, not just a moment of bounty, but a culture of enduring prosperity is celebrated. So the idea here is that this meal, in all its supposed rustic simplicity, is overflowing with calories, stimulus, family, and that's a quintessentially American holiday that celebrates a fundamentally or foundationally or essentially American condition. And what we might want to ask, and what we're going to ask, is what is the material substrate or the material and historical precondition for this collective ritual, right? What does it recreate in order to create? And on that note, I wanted us to talk about one last aspect of the feast as it's described in this very instrumental consumer products thing, which is the role of forgetting as something that happens. One thing they note is that one thing that happens on Thanksgiving is someone forgets something. Oh my gosh, I forgot to stuff the turkey, or I got all this celery and I forgot to put it in the stuffing. I forgot to do this with the pumpkin pie. And what everyone is supposed to say,
not enough evaporated milk.
Yeah, not enough evaporated milk, right?
This also happens in the Buffy Thanksgiving episode too.
So what happens when someone forgets an ingredient or forgets to do something? What are you supposed to do?
Throw your hands up and say, it's fine. We'll figure it out.
It's even better this way.
Yeah.
It's okay to forget. This is exactly what we wanted. Forgiveness, tolerance, acceptance of flaws. We're all here together. That's the point of it. It's okay to forget little things.
It's like an actual affirmation and even valorization of forgetting. It's better if you forget than if you didn't.
After all, we're all only humans, and look at us enjoying all these things together. We might ask, what is underlying this festival in which superabundance is understood to be a perpetual condition without much consideration or even mystification of what goes into that work of creating that superabundance, whether it be the slaughterhouse or the labels on things or mom's hard work? What's underlying the situation of a holiday that's all about welcoming people and bringing them together in inclusion, even as it actually also separates them? Or what's also at play in this holiday where we come together as a whole, but just feel these kind of bottomless holes inside of us too? And what does it mean that even the idea of forgetting itself is celebrated, provided that forgetting is kept within a tightly delineated notion of togetherness? And the forgetting is only within, did you forget this ingredient? Or did you forget what happened last Thanksgiving? The temporality of that forgetting is always tightly constrained. And so in the next episode, we're going to move from this ritual that brings together families and is all about, in some ways, recreating family and producing certain family traumas or reactivating them, to talk about the history of the holiday, to talk about the political and libidinal economic conditions that gave us this holiday and that are uncannily reduplicated in pretty much every aspect of the thing that we just talked about, whether it be the family relations or the food on the table or the way in which it relates to consumption and capitalism. So that'll drop on Wednesday. And as you travel to your Thanksgivings or as you prepare for Thanksgiving, this can be another way that you can estrange that further, or at least have something new to fight about as the turkey gets carved.
We'll talk to you real soon.
Well, sure. Suppose we don't have a bang-up feast. We're still a lot better off than the Pilgrims.
That's it, Dick. Do you other kids see what Dick's trying to say? Turkey or no turkey, we've still got all the freedoms and privileges the Pilgrims gave us. And out of those privileges have come a lot of things. Things the Pilgrims never even dreamed of.
Why, we could make a list a mile long. Why don't we do it?
This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Dan Yowell. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.